this while we have been talking about how pastoral nomadism is practiced in India. We learned about the patterns of life and movement of certain nomadic pastoralist communities in different parts of the country, be that in the northern part or even in the western and the southern parts. Subsequently, we also talked about how the lives of these people were under threat when colonial rule was established in the country. So now it is time to move beyond the country to another continent, that is to the continent of Africa, and find out about the lives of certain pastoral nomadic communities in that continent and find out how colonial rule also impacted their lives. So let us now begin this lesson on pastoralism in Africa and colonial rule. Now we all know that Africa is the hottest continent in the world. There are a whole lot of plains and deserts throughout this continent. Now while many parts of this continent have undergone the processes of change and transformation, it is not to mean that the nomadic pastoralists no longer exist in this continent. This is because even to this day, over 22 million Africans depend on pastoral activities for their livelihood. By pastoral activities, we mean that these African nomadic pastoralists herd different kinds of animals like buffaloes, cattle, goat, camels, and then they sell the meat, skin, or even milk of these animals. Now these communities are very self-sufficient. They can sustain themselves with whatever they have. They use the animal produce to earn a livelihood. They also look for pastures for giving fodder to their animals. So in the truest sense of the term, the pastoral nomadists in Africa or in different parts of the world live or used to live really independent and autonomous lives. But their lives have been under severe changes when colonial rule was established in different countries. Likewise, the lives of these African nomadic pastoralists also changed rapidly. They started losing their independence. They started losing their customary rights over the grazing lands. Their grazing lands started shrinking. A whole lot of changes contributed to their eventual decline over time. So now it is time to find out about few such communities and how their lives were under the threat during colonial rule in Africa. Now, certain pastoral communities in Africa would include the Bedouins, Maasai, Berbers, Somali, Boran, and Turkana. Here on this map of Africa, you can locate the regions in which these pastoral communities live. Here on the northern parts, you can find the Berbers and the Bedouins, and towards the eastern parts, you can find the Somalis, the Turkana, the Boran, and the Maasai. Now, the Maasais are one of the most prominent pastoralist groups in Africa. Now let us briefly talk about the geographical location of this pastoral community, as in where can we find them in Africa? Well, they are found spread across the south of Kenya and northern Tanzania. That is, they live in this region, the south of Kenya and the north of Tanzania. Now the Maasais are very well known for their courage and bravery. They are great warriors, and at the same time they live or they earn their livelihood as cattle herders. Now as a very prominent pastoralist group in Africa, the Maasais have lived very autonomous and independent lives since the ages. In this eastern part of Africa, they have lived their lives in their own terms. They have their own systems of governance. They have their own ways of living. But what we are talking about now pertains to the time when colonial rule was not established in Africa. That is to say, we are talking about how the Maasais lived in pre-colonial Africa. And this lesson will be devoted to understanding how the lives of the Maasais changed rapidly following the onset of colonial rule. Now, before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. In which of these African countries do the Maasais live? Do they live in South Africa, Kenya, Angola, or Egypt? Well, the correct answer is Kenya. The Maasais are spread across the southern parts of the country of Kenya. Now, as a pastoralist group, mobility played a very important role in the lives of the Maasais. And they were a very dominant pastoral group, which is why they were spread across a large region. And in the place where the Maasais lived, this region was called the Maasai land. Now, prior to the colonization of Africa, that is before the colonial rule was established in Africa, this Maasai land stretched across a huge area that spanned across North Kenya to northern Tanzania. So here you can locate North Kenya to northern Tanzania. It's such a huge region that together comprised the Maasai land. But subsequently, during the 19th century began the scramble for Africa. Now, what do we mean by the scramble for Africa? When the European powers were settling their colonies in different parts of the world, they were fighting amongst themselves in order to get the biggest amount of colonial holdings. They wanted to possess as much land as possible, which is why they fought amongst themselves. Now, when colonization was at its peak in the late 19th century, the European powers were embroiled in severe fights among themselves, and this came to be known as the scramble for Africa. All these European powers were trying to get as great colonial holdings in Africa as possible. And it is with this scramble for Africa that this Maasai land now got broken up, and it got divided between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. So this became British Kenya and this became German Tanganyika. So this former Maasai land that was so great in size now got divided into two colonial holdings of two different European powers. Now, when the colonial powers established their rule and control over different countries, be that in Africa or Asia, they were very keen on extending their control over everything, be that the lands or the people who lived on those lands. We learnt about how the Maasai land got divided into two halves. And when the Maasai land got divided, what do you think happened to the people who lived in the Maasai land? As in, what happened to the Maasais or the indigenous people of that region? Well, the white colonizers took over the best grazing lands because they were keen on maximizing their revenue, which is why they took control of whatever they could. Now, Africa is a region that is already very dry. It's not a very fertile tract of land, which is why any kind of good grazing land that was available there almost invariably went under the possession of the white colonizers. Now, what happened to the people who were living there? Well, the Maasais were now pushed to a small arid area in South Kenya and North Tanzania. Now, this map shows you the region where the Maasais were now restricted. It was towards the south of Kenya and the north of Tanzania. So, formerly the Maasai land was such a huge tract of land from which they got reduced to such a little space to be confined within. And this region was not even very fertile because this region did not receive sufficient rainfall. And so, because of poor rainfall or less amount of rainfall, this region also yielded very poor pastures. So, in all kinds of ways, the lives of the Maasais as well as their livestock were now under threat only because the colonial rule was established in this region and the Maasai land got broken up between the British Kenya and the German Tanganyika. Now, like in India, the colonial powers turned the pastoral lands into cultivable fields. Now, their intention remained very same wherever they established their colonies. All they wanted is the maximization of profits. All they wanted to do is earn more and more revenues. Now, from grazing lands, the colonizers could not gain any profit, which is why the pastoral lands or the grazing lands were now transformed into cultivable fields. Now, what happened to the peasants who were living there? Well, the peasants of East Africa were now encouraged to expand cultivation by the British colonial government, because this was not meant to look at the interests of the peasant communities. Instead, this was to serve the colonial government and its imperatives. So, by pursuing agriculture in more and more cultivable lands, more number of crops will be grown. And by the growth of more number of crops, the British colonial government and different other European colonial governments would be able to meet their growing demands as well as earn more profits. So, all that was done by the colonial government was meant to take care of its own interests, leaving behind the interests of the indigenous communities that have lived there for many centuries. The plight of the Maasais never seemed to end. Firstly, their Maasai land got broken up. They were pushed to a small arid region which was very dry and infertile. Then their grazing lands were converted to cultivable fields. And along with that, huge portions of Maasai grazing lands were also turned into game reserves. Now, what do we understand by game reserves? Any tract of land or any tract of forested region that is protected for wild animals is known as a game reserve, and a huge proportion of Maasai land was transformed into game reserves by the colonial government. This now gave birth to many new national parks like the Serengeti National Park that is in Tanzania and the Masai Mara and Samburu National Parks which are in Kenya. Now, these national parks serve as very good spots of tourist attraction. But what happened to the Maasais? They were no longer able to enter these national parks, let alone use these as grazing fields. So it were the Maasais, the pastoralist communities, who were at the receiving end of all the bad things that the establishment of colonial rule entailed. Now we know that Africa is a very hot and dry continent. Droughts are very frequent there because this continent does not receive proper amount of rainfall in most of the regions, which is why you can see drought conditions frequently take place throughout different African countries. Now, severe drought conditions further jeopardized the life of the Maasais. Firstly, the Maasais lost their lands, and whatever grazing lands remained were transformed into game reserves or cultivable fields. And they were not even allowed to move freely between these various regions. And whenever drought conditions took place like this, there was no fodder, no forage for their cattle, for their livestock. So it became increasingly difficult for them to feed their animals, which is why hunger and famine now became very regular parts of the Maasai's lives. They were not able to feed themselves, they were not able to move to new regions to look for pastures for their animals, Earlier on, when they were able to move freely throughout the Maasai land, they used to move to those regions which still remained slightly less hotter than those regions which were under severe drought conditions. And in this way, they ensured that their animals got the forage that they required for their sustenance. But under colonial rule, everything, as in all this movement and looking for forage, became a thing of the past. Now, the colonizers did influence many things that put to stress and severe strain the lives of the Maasais. Firstly, all their lands were taken away, and along with that, the Maasais were also prohibited from entering markets. Now, the Maasais earned their livelihood by herding cattle and livestock along with trading different commodities at the markets. Now, when the colonizers came to power over Africa, they established their own markets, and in these markets the Maasais were not even allowed to enter, let alone being allowed to trade there. And so these people were no longer allowed to participate in any kind of trade activities. And so the Maasais no longer had any way to earn a livelihood. Their lands were gone, their livestock was gone, and now were gone the trading activities that they formerly participated in. So this now brings us to an end of our discussion on pastoralism in Africa and how the lives of the Maasais were put to jeopardy following the establishment of colonial rule throughout Africa. In our subsequent lesson, we will focus on the lives of the Maasais as it were in pre-colonial Africa, and from that we will talk about how their systems of governance became very different when the British colonial rule was established throughout the continent. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million+ questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.